think of a more important topic than the violence or the conflict that surrounds elections. Indeed, as an American looking at our own upcoming election, I don't think that aside from the outright violence, there's certainly a lot of verbal violence that's going on. I don't think that we are immune, we in the States are immune from this also. The classic democratic theory points to elections as a kind of endpoint. Look, we can declare victory, and the usual mantra is that people have turned from bullets to the ballots. But in fact, perhaps the greatest tragedy, the thing that we have to understand, is when the bullets accompany the ballots. And unfortunately, in 2015, that was the case with the Nigerian elections, and as Jergot points out, with the Abuja agreement, there was some sense that this had to be remedied, and also some worry not only about Nigeria, but worry that the lessons learned in Nigeria, very painful lessons learned in Nigeria in 2015, are not adequately understood or communicated to many of the other African nations that are themselves having just concluded or right on the verge of elections. So these are crucial topics. Indeed, they're a crucial topic here in America for our own election, but there's certainly crucial topics in other parts of the world and in Africa. So with that, I welcome Jacob. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean, for your introduction. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to make this presentation on mitigating electoral violence and lessons from Nigeria's 2015 elections. I have an outline there. In discussing this topic, I'll give a very brief introduction. Then also briefly talk about what I call the electoral context in Nigeria to give some background. Then I will zero down on the electoral reform measures which the Electoral Commission introduced to the 2015 general elections. There were many measures that were meant to improve the integrity of elections that were introduced. There was also a specific emphasis on how to mitigate electoral violence, and then I will speak about that before concluding with the lessons that can be drawn from our experience in Nigeria. Obviously, lessons will not make much sense until we understand the challenges that were faced. So I will also try to say a little bit about some of those challenges that we faced. By way of introduction, I would like to say that for a long time, whenever Nigeria was in the news globally, at least for 2 decades, it was for negative reasons. Either it was because of the reckless misrule under military rule, or about violence related to ethno-religious conflicts, or it is about corruption governance, or even financial crimes in the 1990s and the early 2000s, so-called 419. And more recently, it was about Niger Delta militants and the Boko Haram phenomenon across the eastern part of Nigeria. But in 2000, Nigeria was in the news for, I think, a good, positive reason. The 2015 general elections were widely acclaimed as free, fair, and non-violent, which was really a marked departure from the history of badly conducted elections and violent elections in Nigeria's political history. And I think the 2011 elections were generally acclaimed to have broken the vicious cycle of fraudulent and violent elections. So So basically what I try to do in this presentation is first of all to speak about the preparation and the conduct of the 2015 general elections, and then to discuss the measures that were taken by the Electoral Commission, INEC, for mitigation of electoral violence. And as I mentioned, to also say something about the challenges faced and the lessons that have been learned. Now, Nigeria has had a very long history of violence related to elections. In the First Republic, the period between 1960 and 1966, the key aspects or attributes of election violence were what were called the waiting, a situation in which rival political parties would identify their opponents and put a tube around their necks, put petrol, and set them on fire. This was a very, very serious problem, particularly in the Western region crisis, and obviously it set the pattern and the trend of violence related to elections. In what we call the Second Republic in Nigeria, between 1979 and 1983, we began to see a situation in which political parties organized what they call youth wings, and they plan and organize them and finance them so that they would also be targeting election units, either to disrupt them or to snatch ballot boxes or to even attack their political opponents. In the Fourth Republic, that is since 1999, when we began what we now call the Fourth Republic in Nigeria, we begin to see an even more organized pattern of using youth that are armed with small arms and sometimes even more sophisticated weapons. And we also saw a lot of assassinations of political opponents in the political sphere. So violence has always been a major feature of elections in Nigeria, and it also was on the increase in the Second Republic from 1999 to the 2003 election to the 2007 election. So it was a major issue that the Electoral Commission had to pay attention to in terms of what measures can be deployed and how violence can be mitigated in elections. Of course, addressing violence is just one aspect of the general reform measures that were introduced by the Electoral Commission in order to improve the integrity of the conduct of elections in Nigeria. In particular, the elections that were conducted in 1999 at the onset of the Fourth Republic were conducted under military rule, because military rule organized and piloted the transition to civil rule. So really there wasn't much violence in the conduct of the election, even though there were a lot of allegations about carefully planned, organized, fraudulent activities targeted at getting a winner that was favored by the military rulers. It was very subtle, but conducted in such a manner as to deliver a result that the departing military rulers preferred. But 2003 witnessed tremendous violence in the electoral process with assassination of key political opponents. And by the time we did the 2007 election, violent activities related to election heightened. And of course, the 2007 elections were characterized as the worst elections in the political history of Nigeria. Where for politicians, whether the ruling party or the opposition party, winning by hook or by crook was the objective. And in fact, a very catchy word came onto the political scene where politicians were said to be doing a do or die affair. You would rather die than lose the electoral process, which meant all means were necessary in order to achieve the goal of getting into power. And of course, virtually all the international and domestic observer groups condemned that election, not only for failing to meet what were defined as basic international standards, but also for the violence that characterized that election. And of course, the outcome of that election, the fraudulent activities and the violence, was so much so that they contested, or they gave rise to a contestation of the legitimacy of the candidate who won the presidential elections at that time, President Umaru Musa Yar'Adua. And he himself recognized this, and on the day he was inaugurated, he promised to conduct electoral reforms and acknowledged that the elections that brought him into power were fraudulent, and that he would do his best to clean up the process. And that was how he set up what he called the Electoral Reform Committee under a former Chief Justice of the Federation with 24 other members. And I was privileged to be a member of the Electoral Reform Committee. The committee worked between 2008 and 2009 and made wide-ranging recommendations about what reform measures needed to be introduced in order to improve the integrity of the electoral process. Yar'Adua died, unfortunately, in 2009, and his vice president at that time, Goodluck Jonathan, became the president, and he continued the reforms because there was really pressure for the need of reforming the electoral process. And as part of those reform measures, there was an amendment to the electoral legal framework, and also the committee, the electoral commission then was dissolved, and a new commission was inaugurated in June 2010. And I was privileged to be appointed the electoral commissioner, the national electoral commissioner, and the chairman of the commission in June 2010. And the commission, which I had the privilege to preside, then now planned and deployed a number of reform measures targeted at both improving the integrity of the election, making it more transparent, creating a more level field for participants in the process, and most especially for mitigating violence related with the elections. I will give you an idea of many of the reform measures that were introduced before zeroing down on the issue of violence, measures to address election violence. The first thing the Commission did was to, of course, after a thorough study and engagement with stakeholders, the Commission took the decision that the integrity of an electoral register is related to the integrity of the election. And a lot of the challenges of the past were because the register lacked credibility. We took a look at that register and it was incredible what we saw in it. There are all sorts of fictitious names on the register, from Mike Tyson to Queen Elizabeth II, and all sorts of names. And we felt that the register had to be cleaned and it has to have integrity. And we decided that to get a register with integrity, it was necessary to do biometric registration. And the challenge was time, because the Commission came in June. By the existing legal framework, we had to do an election, June of 2010, we had to do an election by January of 2011. And now we said we needed to do a new register. So we had to engage the government and the National Assembly, that's our parliament, for a constitutional amendment. It's probably one of the record amendments of the Constitution that we've ever had, where the time was now extended and the election was shifted from January 2011 to April 2011. And within that period of 8 months, we now had to do the registration and also organize and conduct the election. It was very trying, very challenging. Many of our development partners thought we couldn't do it, but we tried our best and were able to do it. But it required a very expensive methodology to be able to do that. We had to buy equipment and deploy registration equipment in each of the 120,000 polling units. When, if we had more time, we could have purchased maybe 1/3 of that number and then move them from one constituency to the other to be able to do election. But it was necessary, and we believe it would add to the integrity of the process, and indeed, at the end of it, did that. So we scaled up the use of technology. First was the compilation of the biometric register of voters. We were able to, within a period of 3 weeks, using this very expensive methodology, to register 73.5 million voters. And to be able to, we also were able to set up databases. First of all, a database in each of the 36 states and the Federal Capital Territory, so that it can house the election register of that state, and then a national database that now has all the registered voters nationally. We also established 2 disaster recovery centers just in case, and then we used what is called an AFIS, fingerprint identification software, to clean the register as much as was possible before the conduct of the election in 2011. We were able to remove about 870,000 multiple registrations in the register before the elections. But then after the 2011 elections, we now devoted a lot of time and energy to further review, doing deduplication and removing additional duplicates in the register. By the time we did the election in 2015, even though we were doing what we call continuous registration and updating the register as people became 18, the register had come down to about 69 million. So by the time we did that election, we believed that we had a relatively clean register, and certainly the best register we've ever had before the conduct of an election in the history of Nigeria. Now, after establishing the register, of course, we now decided to address one area of major electoral fraud in the history of elections in Nigeria, and that is the use of officials of the commission by politicians in order to declare fraudulent results, regardless of what the real results were. When we came into INEC, particularly after the 2007 elections, INEC had already established a reputation as a commission where results went to the highest bidder. And all this because of the activities of some staff within the commission. So we had to do a lot to do that, but the first thing we did was to try to insulate staff of the commission from the declaration and computation of results before returns are made. And we use the National Youth Service Corps members. In Nigeria, we have a National Youth Service Corps scheme where young men who have graduated from higher institutions, tertiary institutions, do a one-year national service, and they are sent to areas other than their own, to promote national unity and national integration. So, and at any period, there are at least about 300,000 of these young men and women doing national service. So we agreed with the directorate of the NYSC and entered into a memorandum of understanding, and we assured them about measures we would take for securing these young men and women and motivating them. And we now made them the presiding officers of polling units. Regrettably, in Nigeria, as many of you probably know, in many African countries, it's difficult to use volunteers to run polling units because politicians can volunteer people so that they can give them the results of the elections. And, so we thought, and in Nigeria before then, the local civil servants that were being used, and many of these were either threatened, their jobs threatened, their careers threatened by incumbent governments when they do election duty. So we felt that if select staff of the commission and also remove the civil servants who can come under pressure to alter results and use these young men and women to preside over polling units. And it worked very well. They did their job very well, very passionate, educated young men and women, and who considered what they were doing as national service, and who added integrity to the process. At the higher levels of collation and return of results, we now brought university professors and senior lecturers, including vice chancellors of universities, to help do the collation of results at collation centers and then the final declaration of results. Again, this was unique, and it added tremendous credibility to the process. And obviously a vice chancellor who may have been a professor in the system for about 30 years and then crowning it by being head of the institution administratively was highly unlikely to compromise all that he had achieved by taking money to declare results. And it served well as well because throughout 2011, 2015, we never had a single case of even an allegation that a vice chancellor had fraudulently declared results. And so was the case with many of those. So we used the NYSC, we used the vice chancellors, and in addition to all this, in order to gain confidence and trust of major stakeholders in the electoral process, we initiated periodic meetings with a range of stakeholders. We had series of regular meetings with civil society organizations where we presented our plans, where we got their input, and also sensitized them to what we are doing. And by so doing, increasingly, the more they knew what we were trying to do, the more they even became our advocates in terms of sensitizing the public or making advocacy for us in the National Assembly when we needed funds to execute some of these projects. And of course, between 2011 and 2015, as I mentioned earlier on, we devoted a lot of time to cleaning up the register and making it more credible and with better integrity. Now, before the 2015 general elections, when we saw how good the biometric, the register compiled from biometric registration was, we felt we could also keep on using technology to keep on improving the integrity of the elections. When we registered people in January of 2011, we gave them a cold laminated voter's card, which was printed. As soon as you register, you get it, and that was what we used for the 2011 general elections. So now we said, look, let's give what we call a permanent voter's card, which has a contactless chip, which carried all the biometric information that we captured at the point of registration, so that became a smart card really for the voters. And once we took that decision to do that smart card, we decided, okay, why can't we also use a handheld device that can also verify and authenticate voters on election day, so that people, politicians, what they were doing before, would not buy cards from legitimate owners and give it to other people to come and vote on election day. So we had this card reader, a smart card reader, handheld. We developed the specifications in-house. Of course, we have no equipment manufacturers in Nigeria. We had to go to China to have somebody to produce it. But we also had to rely on support from the UNDP in particular to do quality assurance in the production of the cards with the specifications that we developed before they were shipped into Nigeria. And this helped quite a lot, even though there were still challenges. When you are using new technology, there are always challenges. And so we produced smart card readers, about 155,000 before the 2015 general elections. So we deployed a card reader to each polling unit, the 120,000 polling unit, plus redundancies, just in case there is technical failure in the use of these cards. And of course, now everybody says that the use of the card reader was also very, very significant in terms of improving the integrity of the electoral process and ensuring the conduct of a better election in Nigeria. For the first time, for example, dead people didn't vote. Because in the past, dead people were voting, you know. They would be on the register, it wasn't cleaned up, and some other people will come and claim they were the ones. And somehow they got voted. Politicians couldn't buy cards and give to other people to come and vote, because when they come to vote, their fingerprints are authenticated. You know, and of course, it went generally well. This is how the smart card reader looks like. This is my own. It's a contactless chip embedded biometric details. This is how the card readers look, what they look like. And basically, you swipe the card under the card reader, you know, and then all the details saved on the chip will pop up on the screen, you know, and then you put your fingerprint on the device, and then it has a voice facility that can announce to the hearing of people in the vicinity whether verified or not verified. So it went a long way to reassure people that really, unless people were determined and there was a community connivance, it would be very, very difficult to have fraudulent elections in that context. Now, between 2011 and 2015, we also did restructuring and reorganization of the Commission in order to bring greater efficiency and effectiveness. Public institutions are very, very weak in most third world countries, and certainly very, very weak in Nigeria. And we just had to, we did little repositioning before the 2011 election. But we devoted a lot of time and energy to restructuring the Commission and reorganizing it after 2011, before the 2015 general elections. We were able to, by so doing, put what we call square pegs in square holes. We were able to remove people that we believe had no competence to hold the positions that they were holding. And we were able to establish a very lean electoral management body with efficiency and effectiveness in the delivery of its work. We got the support of development partners to be able to do a lot of training and retraining for the staff of the Commission. We changed the business process, tried to improve and uphold the business process. And we also revised the election year procedures. We did quite a lot. We had a strategic plan covering 2012-2015. Which we implemented religiously, and the main objective was not just to have a better election in 2015, but to make the Electoral Commission one of the best election management bodies in Africa. And we had a strategy and implemented it religiously. We had a gender policy to try to engender, as we called it, the electoral process, to improve gender relations within the Commission, which were very bad at the time we came in, and also generally improve the participation of women in politics and in the electoral process. We designed what we call a communications policy to help us improve communication with voters, with citizens, and sensitization. Because at the time we came in the Commission, again, there was a lot of disillusionment. Many people are withdrawing from the process. They were saying our votes would not count, so why participate in the electoral process? So we had to design messages that would make people reassured that their votes would count, so that they could come and participate. And that policy communications policy helped us to do that. Now, more specifically with regards to election violence, we had to devise a lot of measures to address the phenomenon of violence in elections in Nigeria. And the first thing we did, even before the 2011 elections, was to establish what we call an interagency consultative committee on election security. And this is a platform that was structured at the national level, at the state level, and by the time we did the 2015 election, we even scaled it down to the local government level. And at the national level, it consisted of the chairman of INEC and the National Security Advisor as co-chairs. And then it brought the police, the army, actually the armed forces, represented at very high level, and all other paramilitary agencies. And of course, at the time we started it, people are saying, look, we should have less security involvement in the election. But we said in Nigeria, there are peculiar systemic security challenges. And you need security agencies to be able to play a credible role. Otherwise, the electoral process will not be secure, and there will be serious challenges of violence that can disrupt it. So we rationalized it, we got the buy-in of the security agencies, and the ICSES was meeting almost periodically to be able to discuss preparations for election, to get the buy-in of the security agencies, to have to reduce what we very easily identified as we came into the commission, rivalries among security agencies and mutual suspicions and fears, and to be able to have synergy in the ways in which the security agencies become involved in election. The ICSES helped us to define the role we expected each security agency to play in the electoral process. And of course, the police remain the major security agency, but the armed forces are there to provide what we define as outer peripheral cordon. In case there is a serious security threat, which the police cannot handle, then the armed forces would come in. They will be mobilized, they will be somewhere, and if the need arises at the invitation of the police, then they could come in to intervene. These are very, very important measures, particularly in areas where there are threats of insurgency or threats of militancy, like the Niger Delta and some parts of the north, in particular the northeast. So ICSES did its best, but we established it in January of 2011. We had to do election in April of 2011. So really, it was just getting off the ground when we did the 2011 election. Of course, we saw better performance of security in elections than we had ever seen in Nigeria's electoral history before, in terms of the synergy, in terms of relative impartiality, even though political parties would always accuse one another of manipulating the security agencies. And in fact, incumbent governments are always accused of using the security agencies to help them in winning elections. But the evidence we had clearly showed a remarkable departure from the past in terms of the professionalism of security agencies in the management and conduct of election. Now, in addition to the establishment of ICSES, we also, before the 2015 general elections, deployed what is called an election risk management tool. This is a technologically, a tool which was developed by International IDEA and which was supported by the African Union and was first deployed in Kenya during their 2012 general election. It is a tool that helps an election management body, first of all, to do security assessments and mapping of risk factors, and in terms of low, medium, and high risk, and to be able to develop measures to address this in accordance to whether they are medium, high, low. and with a reporting system that relies on partnership with non-governmental organizations that are located in different communities all over the country that can be reporting on the risk factors, and that now helps the headquarters of INEC, the electoral body, to now do the mapping. And once we did this mapping, we now took it to the ICSES, the Interagency Consultative Committee on Election Security, and it helped the planning and the deployment of security in order to address the identified challenges, and even the movement of security. More would go to areas that are high risk, and of course less to areas that are not defined as so risky. So we found that tool to be very, very useful. The Kenyans, of course, assured us that they found it useful, and we found it very, very useful. And of course, I think the key challenge in Nigeria now is how to upgrade that tool and how to make it even more effective in the actual information gathering and the mapping, and then the strategies to address this. Then, of course, we paid attention to the traditional methods of sensitization, community mobilization, in order to promote peaceful conduct, to do conflict resolution, and also to address the likelihood of violence in communities. In this regard, we partnered with traditional rulers, we partnered with religious leaders, and we partnered with community leaders. And tried to get their buy-in, provided them a lot of information, organized meetings and dialogues, both at the national level, including the umbrella organizations of these stakeholders, and at the state level, and also even at the local level. We encourage the electoral officers at the local government level to also be able to do that. And obviously, this we found very, very useful, because in the Nigerian context, traditional rulers, perhaps more than the modern state institutions, had better understanding and appreciation of security challenges in their localities. And the information they provide and the role that they play actually went a long way in terms of addressing challenges of peace and associated violence in these communities. Then at the national level, we partnered with the Peace Committee. And I think this is a very important innovation. I must admit here that we were not the first to do it in Nigeria. In Ghana, when they did their elections in 2012, they had what they called the Kumasi Accord. And we studied it, and we thought it would be very useful. And we encouraged leading opinion leaders to do this. And luckily, Father Matthew Hassan Kuka, who has been a very supportive bishop to the commission, who was also, along with me, a member of the Electoral Reform Committee, took it up and got General Abdul Salam Abubakar, the one who actually ushered the 1999 Fourth Republic, as a military leader, to now play this leading, credible role of peace promotion, conflict mitigation in the electoral process. And we partnered with them, and I participated as a member of the Peace Committee in their meetings, although not in their engagements, because when they are engaging political parties or candidates, I stayed away. But at their own meetings, I participated, gave information, listened to what they are planning to do, and was actively involved in the plans that they planned and deployed in that regard. And of course, their activity resulted in the signing of what came to be known as the Abuja Accord. And the Abuja Accord was basically a very strong statement which the candidates of all political parties signed, supported by the chairman of the political parties, eschewing violence conduct, affirming their commitment to the code of conduct for politicians and for parties in the conduct of the elections, and also undertaking to eschew hate speech, and also to warn their supporters against violent activities related to the election. And the Peace Committee was able to get international partnership in this. Emeka Anyoku, who was the former Secretary General of the Commonwealth, and Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of UN, all participated and were actually physically present with President Buhari, President Jonathan, all the presidential candidates at that time, to sign that accord. And they made statements in addition to what they signed, pledging non-peaceful, non-violent elections. So we did quite a lot focusing, recognizing the need to mitigate violence in elections, both before the 2011 elections and especially after the 2011 leading to the 2015 general elections. One thing that compelled us to do even more after the 2011 general elections was because even though there were relatively lower incidences of violence in 2011 compared to 2007 and earlier elections, there was a massive post-election violence that resulted in death of over 1,000 people. And it was really something terrible that happened. I think, benefit of hindsight, both the Electoral Commission and the security agencies relaxed when on election day it appeared that there was very little violence. And once the winner was announced, unfortunately, in the key strongholds of the candidate who lost the election, there was an explosion, and the properties were destroyed, people were killed, regrettably, including 9 youth corpers that were involved in the process. With that incident, we now devoted even more time and the energy in planning for the 2015 general elections. And of course, in addition to the insurance that we signed for the youth corpers and all staff involved in the election, we also improved on deployment of security, not only for election materials and polling units, but also for the youth corpers. We identified their residences and ensured that 2 weeks before the election and 2 weeks after the election, there was security to protect them, because in 2011 some of their residences were targeted, and that's why some of them were killed. And of course, we got the federal government to also provide some compensation, although you can never compensate for loss of life, to the families of these young men and women. Of course, again, referring to that information helped us a lot in terms of getting traditional and community leaders to be involved in the preparations leading to the 2015 general elections. So we did quite a lot in terms of increasing the regularity of meetings of ICSES, improving engagement and partnership with civil society organizations, and also improving our working relationship with police. Many people are wondering, there are all sorts of conspiracy theories on the day we declared the elections, and many people are wondering, what happened. And to be honest, benefit of hindsight, it was an excellent working relationship that we had with the police, and particularly the Inspector General of the police at that time, that prevented the scattering of the 2015 general elections. They recognized they had a role to play, and they had to do it impartially and on a non-partisan basis and professionally. And the IG was committed to that. And we agreed that at the Coalition Center, they will deploy security, and that none of those originally deployed can be changed at the last minute or under any circumstances. And he lived by his word. So even when, I don't know, not many of you probably have heard of Mr. Oludede, but in Nigeria is a popular name now, who tried to disrupt, who tried to disrupt the elections, you know. It was alleged that he came with a set of security and wanted to replace the security of the body at the coalition center. He couldn't do that. So he had to come in alone. And made all sorts of noises and utterances, but there was nothing he could do. So we just sat him out until he got exhausted. And obviously, again, a lot of backroom communications went on. And in the end, we were able to declare the result. So partnership, credible partnership with security agencies helps a lot. Even though we have to recognize that there are always suspicions and fears that the security could be used by incumbent regimes to scuttle election results. I think I will. I hope the what do you call it? The slide will be circulated so people will see more of this information that is contained in there. So basically, I want to say that the 2015 general elections went well relative to previous elections. It was perceived to have greater integrity, more transparency, and it was more peaceful relative to other elections. And what is even more significant was that it resulted in the first democratic transfer of power in Nigeria's history. Yes. And it ended the rule of a party that had been in power for 16 years and that had pledged to continue to be in power for 16 years. You know? And I think the people also gained a lot of confidence in the fact that with determination and active participation, their votes can actually count, particularly if or when an electoral commission is up and doing in terms of demonstrating impartiality and partisanship and independence in the way it conducts its work. Of course, the elections were praised domestically and internationally. And for the first time also in Nigeria's history, the incumbent president called the winner and congratulated him, which is something that rarely, never happened in Nigeria, and I don't think it's probably rarely happens in Africa. It has happened anywhere in Africa before that. I have some figures here, just focusing on death associated with violence in elections. I think what the statistics indicate is that, of course, violence is still there, yes, it has always been, but we are beginning to get it reduced. And 2011, normally elections are categorized into what happens before the election, during the election, on election day, and after. In 2011, about 100 people died, were reported to have died. On election day, 2011, about 20 people were reported to have died. But after the election, was what I described earlier on, about 938 people have died in a few states in the northern part of the country. But in 2015, pre-election, about 58 were reported to have died. On election day, about 19 people were reported to have died, most of them in the southeast, in particular in Rivers and Akwa Ibom. And there was no reported incidents of post-election violence. Now, this may have to do with the definition. How do we define election violence? And I think scholars may have to begin to address that. For example, there was wide jubilation on the declaration of Muhammadu Buhari as the president after the election. And some young men in some parts of Nigeria, Abuja, Katsina, Kaduna, went on wild street jubilations. This Okada, what we call the Okada motorbikes, you know, and of course there are accidents and a few people died. You know, but it wasn't classified as election violence because they died out of jubilation. But it's jubilation related to elections. You know. So if we take that into account, perhaps we can say that there are also some people who have died post-election. But I think in general, one would say that the statistics give a good pointer. This does not say much about destruction of properties, because there were cases of destruction of properties. There were a couple of assassinations of opposition parties, but much less compared to previous elections. And there were violent clashes when supporters of opposition parties met on the campaign trail, you know, because of this phenomenon of arming of youth. But so in general, most domestic international observers thought that it was a good election. It was widely acclaimed. There was even a survey by the International Federation of Electoral Systems in 2015, which gave statistics which were quite encouraging for maybe another time to talk about this. And then the challenges. Saying what has been done, I do not need to communicate that there were no challenges that were faced. There were really many tremendous challenges that we faced. There were challenges associated with the technical aspects of compiling biometric register, to the innovative use of adaptable technology, to even setting up of the national databases in a country where we have no equipment manufacturers, and where we have to rely on vendors and foreign companies to provide the technology and to provide also the training for this. And also, in particular, very challenging situations in terms of forging relationships with a range of stakeholders and trying to not only be impartial and non-partisan, but be seen to be so, because perceptions easily develop and create very dangerous tendencies in the electoral process. And, of course, the challenge of dealing with a government in power, where the sitting president was keen on being re-elected, and these were very, very challenging situations. But somehow we were able to manage them and to deliver what has now been identified as good election. There are many lessons. Maybe I can quickly go through this now in a minute or two. I think one of the first lessons we can draw from the Nigerian experience, or that we drew as managers of the election, was that electoral reforms can occur successfully in historically complex electoral terrains once a national consensus for reforms is constructed. I think that consensus was constructed after the 2007 elections. And many non-governmental organizations partnered and forged networks and advocated electoral reform, and made President Yar'Adua concede. And there was support for the Electoral Reform Committee, you know, and eventually that led to the composition of the committee, you know, and the implementation of a number of reform measures which I have explained. And secondly, developing capacity to make elections a routine affair enables an election management body to learn from experience and to improve from one election to another. In many electoral jurisdictions in Africa, there is no stability in the election management body. In fact, in Nigeria, the commission which I chaired was the only one that has ever conducted 2 elections. So, and when we were lucky, our tenure struggled through elections. There was the election in 2011 and 2015. We were appointed on a 5-year tenure in June 2010. So all of this fell, but because we were able to do an election in 2011 that was regarded as raising the bar of electoral integrity, then there were no demands for our removal. You know, and we now are able to put the experience of 2011 in the preparations for the 2015 general election. That's very, very important. Learning from experience, consolidating gains, and moving on. Institutional reforms to strengthen capacity is also a prerequisite for the conduct of elections as reform. As I said, most of our public institutions are very, very weak. Many scholars have also been talking even about what they call the decomposition of the state in many African countries. Some talk about collapse of the state, but where the state has not collapsed, then you have decomposed public institutions. You know, and working in those kinds of institutions is really a Herculean task, and you have to come in with a focus to deliver on the objectives, but also on reforming the institutions so that they can actually contribute to delivery. Otherwise, you can spend the whole time settling petty quarrels, you know, dealing with corruption, and not being able to deliver on the key or core mandate. So, and that's why we had to do the structural reorganization, very, very challenging. And you can't rely on the bureaucracy to reform itself. So you have to be very, very creative in terms of how you plan the process and get the buy-in and be able to achieve some reforms that can help to deliver the core mandate. Another lesson, I believe, is that experience sharing with other EMBs is very critical as a part of a learning lesson. And we took this very serious in Nigeria, and we budgeted for getting staff of INEC, both core staff and the commissioners, to go to observe elections in other countries. After 2011 election, we even organized a continental knowledge sharing conference in Abuja, and we had about 25 chairmen of electoral commissions from all over Africa coming, with others being represented, where we told them how we did 2011, the challenges we faced, experiences, and wanted to hear from them. It was very, very good. In fact, some development partners took that serious, and they even pledged to support the strengthening of, at that time, a very weak African Association of Electoral Authorities. You know, and now it's in position and is trying to help that kind of networking at a continental level. So this is very important. We even forge relations where people from our commission can go to other countries and spend some time, either to learn logistics, because deployment of logistics was one of the most challenging aspects of elections in Nigeria. And we sent people to Ghana, sent people to Kenya, sent people to South Africa. And at some point, we even got some people to come from some of these countries to stay with us for a period of time so that we can learn from them as we do this. So that experience sharing and knowledge learning is very, very important. And gaining the confidence of stakeholders is very, very important. Of course, getting resources is important, and we were able to have in the law, electoral law, a relative independence in financing. Once our budget is approved by the National Assembly, it's put in released into an account in the central bank, and it wasn't tampered with. And that's very critical. Many election management bodies had to go cap in hand, looking for funds to conduct elections. And sometimes elections have to be shifted. because there were no resources available to the commission to conduct. That insulated INEC and gave us the relative independence to be able to do some of the things we did. And relations with stakeholders also helped us to explain what we are planning to do and to get the funding for it, like the expenditure on the DDC machines and the expenditure on the card readers. These are really heavy financial outlays. But we were able to persuade government and the legislature to provide these funds. There are many challenges, and I think I will just talk about this. And I want to conclude by saying that Nigeria's 2015 elections have been acclaimed as free, fair, and peaceful, and they represent a remarkable break from the vicious cycle of poorly conducted elections of the past, characterized by massive irregularities and violence. And although there are still many daunting challenges and great scope for future reforms of the Nigerian election processes, I believe that there are nonetheless in the 2015 elections good lessons in terms of their preparation and their conduct and the management of the challenges which other African countries can learn from through knowledge sharing, through knowledge and experience sharing. I want to stop here, and if there are questions, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Jega. We'll just move quickly to the discussants, and after discussions, we'll now open it up to questions. So I'll now call on Professor Penny to give his remarks.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be at ESCAR, and I think I'm probably one of the people in the room here who's followed ESCAR from the days when it was in the trailer up all the way through to where we are now, at independent school, and tackling very real issues. Professor Jega mentioned the 2011 elections, which exploded in a number of post-election violence. We did a conference here at ESCAR on post-election conflict management in Nigeria. And so it's with great pleasure that I kind of held my breath during this 2015 election. I've monitored the elections in Nigeria for many years. And I know the problems. And if you were kind of looking at this the day after, it would be the case of Sherlock Holmes, the dog that didn't bark. And what didn't bark was violence. And so the obvious question is, why? And what are lessons learned? Because if you're used to people, I can't tell you how violent it was in Kaduna in 2011. With burning of churches, burning of mosques, dumping of corpses on lorries. And all of this went viral on social media. Now in an age where that stuff just doesn't stay where it happens. And we were holding our breath that it would not get out of hand. So you can well imagine in a situation where Professor Jega is too modest to kind of talk about his role. I can talk about his role if we want to get down to it. But leadership does matter. You'll notice he kind of went through his talk without really talking about regional, particular subnational challenges. And when you've got a two-party system where one candidate is from far north and one candidate is from the coastal south, and there are ethno-religious identity factors involved, you are talking about a time bomb waiting to happen. And this particular time bomb involves 185 million people, one of the half dozen largest countries in the world, twice the size of Egypt, 3 times the size of South Africa. So you can see why the international community got involved in this as well. And we're wringing their hands, but also wondering what they could do to make sure that when there are winners and losers, and there are ethno-religious regional consequences of this, or you can have another civil war with a country that is 7 times the size of Syria. This is kind of the international implications of 2015 are enormous. And it isn't just one country in Africa. This is a country that is of significance and is Professor Jagan mentioned, this is the first time in Nigerian history, and I have been for every election in Nigerian history, this is the first time an opposition candidate won. So you can see the kind of the stakes involved in this, not only for Nigeria, but for Africa, and indeed, I would argue for the world. There's an old saying that it's not who casts the votes, it's who counts the votes. And I can well remember speaking in collation centers, and I was observing out there, the lights would go out, and people would be calling in numbers with a flashlight, and we just threw up your hands. We hope it's all in as well. Professor Jega has learned the lessons well of Nigeria and of elections. And I just want to say the reason why the dog didn't bark, so to speak, is number one, leadership. Leadership that included the election itself. I think he was well regarded nationally in Nigeria, and certainly internationally. The other thing I think that would be underscored, and by the way, his successor now is another university professor. So you set a high mark. But the fact that you were a president and vice chancellor of the university, the fact that you were the president of the ASU, the Academic Staff Union of Nigeria, gave you national credibility and authority. So you don't just pick a bureaucrat to do it, you pick someone who has credibility. You'll see that Professor Mahmoud, the successor, is up to that. I personally think leadership at INEC matters. Good organization and biometric initiatives are important, and it's another reason why we were all holding our breath. Biometric technology, fingerprints, scanners that came in from China somewhere. I can't tell you how concerned people were who just know the realities of Nigeria, where electricity goes out, and anything can happen. To whether this was too complicated to deal with 155,000 polling stations. 155,000. Now, the organization of the youth corps there and all of the other organizational meetings as well, but it turned out that those biometric things made a difference in retrospect. It may not be suitable for everyone, but if it can be done in Nigeria under the circumstances where you have 3 million internally displaced people, we have to deal with them, we have Boko Haram plowing to kill people at the polling. These were extreme circumstances. And then, of course, the larger question is that he raised at the end there is how do you count post-election violence? Because it isn't just the day after the events. We're still now beginning to say, well, there are losers. What are they doing? They have billions of dollars tucked in banks. They're causing some trouble down in the areas. So there are consequences for ongoing need for conflict resolution measures here. It isn't just, wow, we got through that one. I wouldn't go back to whatever they were doing before. But the leadership of INEC, the good organization, the biometrics, and I think this peace accord is important. It could have been violated, and so I give credit to both Jonathan and to Buhari. And the fact that Jonathan made that phone call was crucial, conceding. He could have gone to the courts. We could still be litigating this 15 months later or something. And the courts would have come out in his favor. And then there would have been a breakdown of a failed state of 185 million. And this would have been a disaster of global proportions. So the peace accords did matter, and I think it is fair to say that the British Foreign Secretary of the U.S. Foreign Foreign Secretary.
Secretary of State.
The Secretary of State, I was on the phone with his office this morning, I should know. We're there, and we're lending the support of the international community to say, do it right this time. We don't want any shenanigans. If you've won, fine. If you've lost, concede. And be a gracious winner and a gracious loser. So the peace accords were, in a sense, just a symbol of that. The reality was what would happen, you know, when the announcements were made. So there's an international role in here as well. The challenges that I think he touched on in a kind of an overview, I don't think do justice to the complexity of Nigeria. You've got parts of Nigeria that are inaccessible by road. How do you get election results back to win? He's the one who had to stand up at the collection center in Abuja and make the announcement. So-and-so, these are the results. Or so-and-so, these are the results. So-and-so, stamp of approval. That's what the United Chairman does. But in the past, it has not always worked out well. He began to describe if someone burst through that door right now and said, I want the microphone, and by the way, I've got a bunch of police outside or military outside who support me and not you, and we think this whole thing needs to be rethought here, and by the way, the military sort of agrees with us, etc. You can see the pressure that was put on him. It isn't just management style, it is raw courage that I think needs to be understood here. I mean, life-threatening courage. That you're trying to do the right thing. There are often consequences which we can sit in an academic environment and do our statistics. It doesn't seem to kind of factor in, but leadership and raw courage, I think, do matter here. So the bottom line lesson, I think, it can be done in one of the, I think, one of the two most complex countries in the world, along with India. If it can be done in Nigeria, there is hope for non-violent elections. But I don't think we want to just take it for granted that that happens. The amount of pre-planning that went into this is, it's enormous. Okay, they have to isolate their finances. They have to do the deals with the national security advisor. They have to, and in fact, the national security advisor postponed the elections for 6 weeks. And so what does INEC do at that time? It gets more and more complex. And so how you weave your way through that and still end up with with results that people regard as free and fair, although we're not out of the woods yet on that. Professor Jago, whom I've known for many, 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 many years, just told me that the leadership media group in Nigeria is now going to be honoring 3 people for their role in the elections. President Jonathan, who made the phone call, President Buhari, who was gracious, and Professor Jago, who ran the best elections that I think I've ever seen in Africa. Thank you very much, and I hope ESCAR will stay in touch with these complex problems.
So we now turn to Professor Lyons to give his remarks.
Over here. Thank both of you for those wonderful remarks. I'll try to be brief and allow questions to come in. When I was taking notes on what I was distilling as sort of the lessons from the Nigeria 2015 case, I kept writing leadership down time and time again as well. I didn't have the background that Professor Payden did, but the importance of leadership comes through quite powerfully. I want to say a couple of kind of academic framing remarks around elections and violence, and then just a few comments on the Nigeria case. Elections are always tricky times. Elections are at times when the social fabric is tested, when it's pulled, where you see if it has the pliability to withstand the stress,
or if it tears, if it rips, if it somehow or other is distorted in ways that are unjust and that harm people. And there is a growing literature in the conflict resolution field, or the political science of this field, looking at electoral violence, as a particular form of violence. Typically, for some of the reasons that you mentioned, they look at elections, violence 6 months before the election and violence 3 months after the election, in recognition that it's not just election day. Pretty arbitrary to say 6 months and 3 months. And they found, for example, that it's often state-incited violence before the election, and then opposition-incited violence after the election. That the state uses violence to influence the outcome before, but then the kind of street protests that come after are more often triggered, more often instigated or led or encouraged by the opposition. But there's a challenge with how to understand that whole concept of electoral violence. Is electoral violence a thing of itself, or rather is it an episode in a much larger, longer trajectory of political violence? In other words, electoral violence is not its own type of violence, but rather elections are triggers that unleash deeper divisions. Clearly, again, from the introduction and from I know mostly from reading John Payton's books, that Nigeria has a deep, deep set of conflicts, North-South just among them, and then the election therefore providing an opportunity for that to come up once again. So rather to say that the conflict that we need to look at is a North-South conflict in Nigeria, with the elections being one episode every 4 years with different variation in terms of the levels of violence, or is there something about 2015 in and of itself? Let me make just a couple of maybe reflections on the Nigeria case, because while I don't know Nigeria well, I have thought about African elections and been an observer in other places, in Ghana and Benin and Liberia and Ethiopia, and so thinking about elections with organizations that sometimes don't rise to the challenges, let me put it that way, weak organizations that were designed to be weak often. The elections process is a very interesting sort of amalgam. On the one hand, it's about institutions. How do you have a credible election? Well, you need institutions. You need an institution that has the capability of cleaning up an electoral list, as Professor Jega told us. There's some 70 million people. Oh my Lord, the scale of Nigeria just makes your jaw drop when, I don't know, Liberia was a couple of million. So the order of magnitude that you get in Nigeria. And so that this takes, kind of classic public policy. How do you manage something of enormous complexity over a timeline and with resources requiring training? How do you insulate your staff was another question you had. And on the other hand, though, it's not just the institutions, it's this leadership piece that Professor Payton spoke about so well that I won't repeat those points. But what I think the outcome of those two things, if they're done well, is something that Professor Jega emphasized. And that is what you want at the end is credibility. You want people to be assured that their votes matter. You want to create the perceptions that this is going to be a credible process. You won't get hurt, your vote will be counted, and in that way. And I don't mean perception because you're really going to do something else, but rather the perception because you've convinced people, you've spoken to them, you've shown them how you're going to do it, you've given them the cards, they've held them in their hands, and so on. Because a credible election, and therefore one that can help manage conflict, is really about how do you build confidence between the people and the state, or the people and the authorities, so that the process is regarded as, I'm not going to say free and fair, although I just did, but that credible, meaningful, an election that people will accept as the basis for moving forward. I think on one of your last slides, you talked about the importance of the careful reconstruction of trust should be the major focus of an EMB, an election management board. And I really do think that that's at the core of this, is how do you build trust, particularly in a context like Nigeria, but other places in the world as well, that has been so polarized, where the prior election boards have been so partisan that it is an enormous task. I mean, I do think that, you know, the next election will have its challenges as well, but it sure is a better place to start today than you had, you know, before 2011 and the elections that were so violent, or even after 2011. And so for that, I think it would breathe a sigh of great relief as we saw the outcome in Nigeria. I'm going to stop there, and because there's so many people in this audience that I know have direct experience and other points that they'll wish to make. So thank you.
Thank you very much, presenters. And I just want to come to Jega specifically, then Professor Peden and Professor Lawrence. This topic to me is a very kind of good topic to be talking at this point in time. Not because we're in America, we're in election time, but for Africa in particular. And as it's very well to talk about, because it's not just a kind of talking about Nigerian election. Because listen to Professor Jega, he talked about what they learned from Ghanaian election to improve on Nigerian election. But maybe in the next coming months, we also have some African countries that will have an election. Gabon, we are still in Gabon now, and maybe Ghana, Somalia, and Gambia before the year ends. So the question is, are these countries learning from what's happened in Nigeria? Because the case of Gabon is of interest to me, because Professor Jega talked about Jonathan calling Buhari to congratulate him. But in Gabon, even before the result was announced, we have a candidate now calling his opponent to congratulate him when the result is not announced yet. So the question is, are they learning from what is happening? So let me just throw it open. Maybe we also have some questions for Professor Jega or Peden or Lights. So thank you very much. Thank you. So any question? Okay. Joel.
Thank you, Professor Jega, for the presentation. I think I have a question with regards to the Constitutional Court or the Supreme Court. I think I was going to ask about, I'll probably talk about two cases where in Cote d'Ivoire, the electoral body came out and said one person won, and then the Constitutional Court decided that the next person won, and then it became a fact. Or in Gabon, where we have the Electoral Commission saying that somebody won, and then everyone is referring to the Constitutional Court to make the final announcement. What was the role of the Constitutional Court in Nigeria?
Okay, we'll take like 3 questions and you respond and we'll come back again.
Professor Jega, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation, and it's good to see you again. And it's exciting to see progress in the election in Nigeria. For those of us who were kids at the time of the 1964, given my age now, I heard my dad and his friends all screaming about what's going on in the Western region that led to the introduction of military into elections, and the outcomes wasn't quite favorable for Nigeria until, of course, 99 that we're talking about right now. I have some questions, but I will probably ask 1 or 2 and then come back later on. One is that how many people actually registered in 2015? I think you said you had registered 73 million in 2011. What's the number for 2015? The card readers that you have, we're told there's some power problems with the card readers. Then President Goodluck Jonathan said he went to vote and the reader couldn't read his card. And so they had to go back to the old-time religion process. Was that an effective way to deal with the problem if there's a failure of the card reader? Was there any mitigations that were planned in case you're in a rural area and the card readers malfunction? And I'll come back to other questions later.
Thank you, Dr. Peden and others. I've been an election officer in this country for over 20 elections, and it takes a lot of preparations. And also, Professor Jega mentioned about institutional capacity, and Dr. Peden mentioned about leadership, institutions. manner. And my question would be, I know that you use the university system to help conduct the election. What about the role of primary education, secondary education in training the next generation so that they can see there is a process? This is how we govern, and this is how we conduct our affairs, so that they can begin the little step-by-step process. And when it comes to their turn, maybe a generation afterwards, they will realize that this is how we do it, conduct the elections. So my question specifically relating to education at the local levels. It's not during the election season, but ongoing thing at primary level.
Okay, so we'll give Professor Jeda a chance to take the question, and then we'll come around. Okay, sure.
Thank you very much for those excellent questions. In Nigeria, of course, I suppose this in many other countries, the role of the Supreme Court, we don't have a constitutional court. So the Supreme Court in Nigeria adjudicates on all matters at the highest level, including matters concerning election or reinterpretation of the Constitution. And basically, in this role, it is expected that they will give judgment as to whether the laws have been complied with, or whether there are breaches which will make them to give a ruling in favor of one candidate or the other. And in our own context, all electoral cases, governors and the presidents will go up to the Supreme Court for a final determination. But other constituencies, from senators to other lower constituencies, it ends at what we call in Nigeria as appeal courts. So once appeals court give a judgment for those lower constituencies, then that's the end of the matter. For presidential elections, governorship elections, it can go up to the Supreme Court as the highest appellate level. And of course, we've had cases where the Supreme Court would nullify a result that has been declared. Luckily, in our time, we didn't have that, but in previous elections, there were those kinds of cases, or even the appeals court, to say that either the rules have not been followed, or there were technical challenges with the primaries. All these things are defined in the electoral law as to what are the things to be done. If they are not done, then the courts can nullify an election because of that. But there is no an electoral commission cannot contest a final determination by a Supreme Court. So even when the electoral commission declares a result, if the Supreme Court says no, this is the candidate, there is nothing that can be done. And they've made some decisions which really have been controversial. I recall in Rivers, the case of Amechi, I think it created challenges with jurisprudence, I think, in Nigeria. You had a case of somebody who contested primaries in the party, but the party did not submit his name as a candidate for the party to contest the election in 2007. So he went to court. Meanwhile, the candidate that the party presented participated in the election and won the election and was sworn in as a governor. And then 1 or 2 years later, the Supreme Court now gave a judgment that actually Amechi was the rightful candidate, and that even though the party did not submit his name, the fact that the party won the election, he was deemed to have been the party's candidate. And up to now, people are wondering about the jurisprudential, basis of that. And so sometimes they can make funny judgments. In Nigeria, particularly at the lower levels, and also mostly in pre-election matters, there were judgments of the courts that were contested as having been voted. So really, it's one of the challenges about corruption in institutions in Nigeria, including the court process. But the Constitutional Court, the Apex Court, has relatively more integrity than the lower courts. So normally they are, except for these exceptional cases I mentioned, normally their judgments are generally accepted. Sometimes because it can be challenged anymore, but mostly it's accepted as it's a good judgment. I did mention some of the figures. We did the election with the registration in 3 weeks, between the middle of January and sometime in February in 2011. That was the initial registration. We established a register. And we registered 73.5 million voters, people of 18 years and above. We expected from our own population projections and people in that cohort, we planned for about 67 million. But we ended up with about 73.5, which created a lot of challenges for us. So one, it raises question about accuracy of population census, and also it had to do with the challenges of multiple registrations, because we were able, in spite of the effort, still remove about close to 1 million, about 870 multiple registrations before we certified the register for elections in 2011. Now, between 2011, after the 2011 election until the 2015 election, we did continuous registration. As people became 18 years, they got added onto the register. But we also kept on doing deduplication and checking cases of multiple registration that may have remained, because we didn't do it thoroughly before the 2011 election. So by the time we did the 2015 general election, there were about 68.8 million. That's why in my presentation I said 69 million. There are close to 69 million people on the register, which meant that through the deduplication, we had removed almost about 4 million in spite of the continuous voter registration that we had done. So basically that was it. And that's why we felt confident that it was probably, certainly the cleanest register in the history of elections in Nigeria.
If you don't mind, Professor, does it mean that out of 170 million people, 170 people are eligible to register for 2015 election? Is that the interpretation?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't mean that those, if you use population projections, there certainly will be more people who are registrable. But getting on the register is dependent on people voluntarily registering. So unless you come out of the, unlike in many other electoral jurisdictions, particularly in countries that have national registration, electoral commissions can go to the national database and take all people 18 years and above, as the part of the register. In Nigeria, we don't have the national civic registration, and the law is very clear that if you are 18, then you have the right to register. But if you don't register, then you can't be on the register. These are legal issues.
Now, the population pyramid looks like that.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So,
The card readers.
Yeah. and power problems. Well, being aware of the power challenges in Nigeria, we used a card reader that used batteries. And in Ghana, they used a card reader that in Ghana they used a card reader, but it read barcodes. It didn't read chips, embedded cards. So they are reading barcodes, and we learned the lesson, because if a barcode is scratched, it can't be read. So that's why we settled for an embedded chip. Even a contact cheap. If it is scratched or if it is for Nigerian farmers, it can get dirty and may not be right, so we settle on it. But in Ghana, they use batteries that are for 8 hours. And they had a system of changing the batteries midway, just to ensure that there is no failure. And unfortunately, in 2012, it created challenges for them. In many polling units, they had to postpone election and come back the following day to do it because of battery failure. So when preparing for our own in Nigeria, we took that into account because we actually observed the Ghanaian election and interacted with the Ghanaian Electoral Commission. So we made sure that our batteries were 12 hours, and we also ensured that we had 3 redundancies in each polling unit just in case. Still, there were challenges because you have to power charge the batteries. And in many areas, the polling units were where there is no electricity. So we had to incur expenses in terms of buying generators for those areas where there is no electricity, just to ensure that all batteries are fully charged before they are deployed into the field the following day. I keep saying our elections were expensive, yes, they were heavy expenditure items. But frankly, on relative terms, if you use the measure of election expenditure, which normally is expenditure per voter, registered voter, we were on average. Our expenditure was $12 per registered voter. But in countries that had relatively small populations, like Ghana or Liberia, it's a very small expenditure, even if it is 15,000 per voter, compared to the huge size of Nigeria, when you have 69 million voters, and the expenditure is that. So really, we thought we had managed election expenditure prudently, even though when you see the quantum of funds, it's quite concerned. It raises concerns. So really we didn't have challenges about power on election day. The challenges we had were in charging the batteries before deployment in the field. But we had failure of the card readers. Technical failure where no card reader function was statistically insignificant. 0.000%. Technical failure, even though we had redundancies. The major failures we had was capturing the fingerprints. Because you have to be authenticated with your fingerprints. And there were reasons why either oily hands or farmers' hands that have been scuffed or all sorts of challenges. We tried to use a high resolution fingerprint scanning device, but still, many people on election day came to the polling units, their fingers could not be read. But we already had a backup position. In case your fingerprint could not be read, with the agreement of the party agents, a form can be signed, and then you can be authenticated to vote. Because we expected it again to be statistically insignificant. Then we faced a major challenge. The President of the Federal Republic went to his polling unit on election day, and his fingerprint could not be read. It really created very serious challenges for us. Now, this may not be the time to discuss about it, but I personally believe that there was something to it more than just yeah. Because leading to the election, the ruling party did everything possible to persuade the Electoral Commission to drop the idea of using the card reader. And we refused. We said, look, we persuaded you, you agreed, you gave us the money. 3 years down the line, we've made the procurement, we've then tasked him. Why can we've spent so much money, why abandon it? So, in fact, as some of you may recall, before the election, even a month or so, when we refused to jettison the use of the card reader, people then said I should go and leave, so that somebody else will come and conduct the election. And I said I had a tenure, and how can I go on leave when a major election was going to take place? And we scaled that. So the failure, and I registered because it was a publicity thing for us in 2011. I went to the president village with the media, and we registered him and all members of his family. And on that day, it was only his own card that failed, not of the members of his family that were also registered. So frankly, up to now, when I reflect, I keep wondering what really happened. But what it did, it put us under tremendous pressure. Because we said, look, it's already in the guidelines, go ahead and sign a form and register him. And that was done because it's already in our election day procedures. But then, soon thereafter, we started receiving reports that the card reader was not reading the fingers of many people in many places. And benefit of hindsight, I think because of that pressure, in many polling units, once that happened, they truncated the use of the card reader in order to affect the results. So these are things that we learn from, and we have to plan to be able to address in future. Maybe that's what I can say on this now. Okay. The question on Rome. In Nigeria, and perhaps this is one of the negative aspects of military rule, civics for a long time was not taught in schools, not to talk about voter or other education. In fact, there was a time in Nigeria under military rule in the mid-1980s when a major advocate of civics was a military general who wrote a book, Civics for Primary Schools, and the role models were actually military generals who fought the Civil War and so on. So it's a serious challenge, and the little we did in the period 2010 to 2015 was to say, look, there is need to catch them young and to begin to introduce voter education and sensitization in the high schools, because those are the cohorts that soon after graduation would be eligible to register as voters. So we had some little funding from our resources and support from the UNDP, and we commenced a program of establishing what we call voter education clubs. And we did a pilot, and the idea is catch them young, teach them the basics of election and the obligations and responsibilities of a voter, the importance of voting, to choose a good elected person. But it was at a pilot stage. We couldn't get resources to upscale it further. So this is a very, very important thing. Now in Nigeria, I think they have brought back, they also stopped teaching of history at some point in high schools. But now that has been brought back. Hopefully teaching of civics will be brought back, and it can take a lot of these issues, both at the primaries and secondary school level.
Professor Peden and Lawrence, do you want to add to your questions? Okay, maybe we can take.
Well, I would be interested in Professor Jega's, now that we're into the Buhari administration, the Minister of Education, Adamu has proposed something that was actually started during the Jonathan administration, which was, instead of having Islamic religious knowledge taught over here and Christian religious knowledge taught over here, to teach them both and to emphasize national value. Now, this is a minefield of emotions in Nigeria. Already the Muslim leaders, some of them are saying, we can't have the same book with Christians. So how do you deal with the textbook? But the idea of dealing head-on with the religious diversity issue as part of the national values, an attempt at, conflict mitigation in these early ages. Where does that stand now, and is it something that's going to happen? Because that would be, in my view, earth-shaking. You not only teach them civics, you teach them that, you're a Muslim, you're a Christian, we're all Nigerians. So think about how important that is. Have you followed that again?
I followed this, but I think what has happened is that because education is on a concurrent list, at the national level, the Minister of Education tries to give a broad framework for the policy, but the actual implementation depends on how serious the local state governors have taken it. And I know that the issue is particularly being pursued passionately in some states in the northern part of the country, where the phenomenon of al-Majri, the young children that are out of modern schools and are said to be in Islamic schools, was becoming a serious challenge. And there is that effort. A lot of very good studies have been made about how you can now integrate the al-Majri school system to the modern school system with a curriculum that can enable them to learn this, and still learn about their religion, learn about other religions, and also have the education which is relevant to being a citizen in the modern world. But the devil is in the implementation. Not many state governments are actually pursuing it with the seriousness that it deserves, even though there is that national policy framework which the minister has now provided.
When I was growing up, I had experience of, we had what we call religious knowledge. That was in primary school. You get to learn about other religions, and as you grow, you just see this is how they worship, this is how they do their thing. And it helped us to be open-minded, and when you see other people, I think it's something, if they can bring that back civic education, I think it would be a wonderful thing.
Okay,
Well, that used to be a very useful thing, but later it became segmented. You have Islamic religious knowledge and Christian knowledge. And so the Muslims will take the Islamic and the Christians will take the other. And so you don't learn from one another. So, but before it used to be one, religious knowledge, which people learn.
Okay, we'll take another round of questions, starting with Charles.
My name is Charles Crawford. I'm from Liberia. I'm also a master's student here studying public policy. Let me use this time to commend you for work you have done in Nigeria. In the electoral process, we know that the role of civil society organizations are very important. So my question has to do how effective were the civil society organizations in educating and sensitizing the people of Nigeria about 2015 elections.
All right, so we'll not turn to Tola, then gentlemen.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tola Adimana. I work with Television Continental in Lagos, Nigeria. My question is, he already asked a question, but the professor did not really touch on it. It's about what lessons do you think other African countries that have upcoming elections can pick, from the 2015 elections in Nigeria? That's the question.
Professor. So many questions. I'm very interested to hear if you're willing to speculate on why it was that the major politicians were willing to agree to sign the Abuja Accord. Somehow I think there must be a very important story behind that. Thank you, sir.
Okay, good. Yeah.
My question is related to while Nigeria is a democracy in Africa today, the next door neighbor Cameroon is in Tonga, yes. And as Cameroon is preparing for elections in 2018, from your experience, what advice can you give Cameroon to at least place them on that path to democracy?
Maybe we can take all the questions at once. Okay.
My question is as regards electoral violence per se. I happen to monitor the elections in Nigeria, providing emergency response for the Red Cross. And I've said that, my comment here just last night on behalf of the Red Cross. And since 1999, I have monitored the election. I was also a poll supervisor. My question is, what is your role, particularly as regards the selection process of candidates? Because in my own experience, the problem with election violence has to do with the candidates themselves, not most about. You talk about the good things you did with the technology and what have you. But let me cast your mind back that in 1993, there was an election in Nigeria, which was adjudged with the fairest and best election. And there was no technology there. People voted and people counted. There were some violence, but it was not as compared to what we had later on. In this particular, the last election, which I didn't monitor, you said so many people, you didn't allude to the fact that the reason why there was less violence or the success of that election was because a lot of people resolved that that election would succeed. Even the incumbent, who was running at that time, couldn't have won because within his own party, it was generally it was unpopular because of the way it managed the election process. And when the election was going, we found a very, very fundamental case about one of the candidates, which is now the president, who we could not find his record of academic success. And it became a raging news. During that period, I never heard the INEC said anything concrete. And maybe I wasn't there about these credentials. Why is it? I came to a conclusion, looking at those elections and those I've monitored, that there is a fundamental problem with the process of what? The emergence of our leaders or candidates. People come from nowhere and they just come in here, maybe because they have money, maybe because they are supporters of one particular, or stooges of one particular big person. Yet, we see their credentials, it's horrible. Some of them are, I'm saying from personal experience, going to election polls, when you talk about what happens, you see police officers, you see people who don't have no business in elective office. You will look at their credentials and you can see that this person, what he claims is not there. So what has been your specific role, or will be your role, in making sure that the credibility, the choice of the candidates that stand for election, even before they get into the ballot box, is verified? Thank you.
Okay, one more question.
Okay. Was quite an energy there. I think you stole part of my question, but which is verification of candidates' credibility as a way of mitigating, letting Nigerians understand that election is not a life and death or death issue. If they say that way, it's either I win and there's no peace. To find a way to let them understand that even if you lose, but lose on what you projected, what your causes are, and that elections are based on ideology and not on personalities in a sense. That was quite a little draw to that. And comment on the elections, the professor, I think we say no drama, Obama, but there's a no drama Jega, because a lot of people didn't see the video when this is talking about a guy with AK-47s and yelling and screaming. He was as calm as a cucumber. And that's quite unusual for a Nigerian in that position. On the issue of the court, Professor Jega, please, with the current chairman there, they still will need your input. I hope all these lessons learned and the experience here and the question can be transcribed to them and to help them be ready better for the next election. The courts really are a complete disgrace to mankind. Supreme Court, Appeal Court, whatever court. For example, Abia State, which is where I come from now, who have two governors. There's a governor that's supposed to have won the election, and was fought by another party. And then that was resolved by the appeal court, or so, or court of appeal. And then there's another person who INEC or the court took the certificate of return and gave it to this other person as to be the bona fide governor of the state. Now, where does INEC stand in this position? Why is the certificate being withdrawn and given to somebody else? Isn't there some, is it the electoral management board that have to sit with the court and say, wait a minute, you're making us look bad, you're making the country look bad, or the state look bad. What is the procedure to mitigate this kind of issue? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think before we now turn the floor ready to Jake and so others to comment, I just want to draw our attention to a comment on the Facebook about this event. The comment was that, according to the writer, was that since Jega left, that everything is gone bad in Nigeria as regards to election. So, and the person actually stated that the election that was postponed last week, that actually the person predicted that it's going to be postponed because since Jega left, all elections are inconclusive.
So he should go back.
Inconclusive. Then again, there was another comment again. Then the person cited security concern because in 2015, when the threat of Boko Haram was highest, so the person said that Jega conducted an election. But in just one state out of the 6 states, security concern was not cited again. Yeah, so the conclusion is that things has gone bad since Jega left. So, and even the person even said, even before talking about other African countries, let us even come back to Nigeria again. Because it's like things seem to be going back since Jega left. Yeah, so maybe you can now advise maybe who is at the helm of affairs now, so that we can actually see how we go forward from here. Because things have gone back since you left. So thank you.
You want me to answer that? Yes, there was a question on how effective were the civil society organizations in education and sensitization. I think they were very important partners to the Electoral Commission leading to the 2015 general elections, especially. They did a very commendable job. We tried to first of all identify those civil society organizations that had a focus and the competence to add value, and we got them into networks, and we worked with them and partnered with them, and they did commendable work. We couldn't finance a lot of their activities, but luckily many development partners from the UNDP and EU and the USAID, they had programs of support for civil society work in the area of credibility of elections and sensitization. So really personally, from the experience of INEC 2011 to 2015, civil society organizations added tremendous value to the work to have elections with integrity. And they helped us, as I mentioned earlier, in generating information about the election violence, which we used for the electoral risk management tool. They helped us in sensitization. They were our advocates when we met with them and explained what we wanted to do. They helped us to further put pressure on the legislators who explain if there are challenges amongst the political parties. They also have a series of engagements which supported our work. And so really an electoral commission needs to forge good and strong relationships with civil society organizations in order to keep on improving the integrity of elections in Africa. That's very, very important. There are two questions, one about what lessons for Africa and the other what lessons for Cameroon. I'll take them together. And I would say that for me, one of the key lessons really is for an electoral commission to ensure that it is effective and efficient, and it is not just impartial and non-partisan, but that it is seen to be so. These are very, very important requirements in delivering effective, or rather a good election that is transparent and that can be said to be credible, fair and credible. Also, partnerships have to be forged with different stakeholders. Very, very important. Whether they are civil society organizations or SI Nation in the Nigerian case, religious constituencies, traditional authorities, security technocrats or securocrats, I think as some people call them, and so on and so forth. These partnerships are very, very important. And even development partners have to forge very good relationship, pass information. And there are also commendable role development partners, even on embassies on the bilateral level can do in terms of messaging. And there were times when we have to urge that positive messaging needed to be done in order to prevent challenges that are likely to arise. Many of Nigeria's development partners established a relationship with them, exchanged information, but we were very transparent in our relationship with them, and it added also a tremendous value in that regard. And then knowledge sharing is very, very important. An electoral commission should try to learn what is happening, in their neighboring countries, in other countries in Africa, because we do have similar challenges, and there is no need to reinvent the wheel. You can learn what others are doing and adapt it to your own circumstances, and that way we can keep on improving. There is a lot of local expertise that can add value to reform processes in our continents and in our countries. But we tend sometimes to really underrate them or not even engage them and rely on foreign expertise and so on. It's good to have partnerships, credible partnerships, but also it's good to put to good use what is available and easily utilizable in our context. So these are some of the recommendations that really I can make, which I hope I have made in my presentation. There was a question as to why were the major political parties and candidates amenable to the idea of signing. I think it's really a good question, and I don't think there's an easy, clear answer to it now. But I believe that first of all, the consensus that I mentioned about the need for reforms in our electoral process put a lot of pressure on candidates and on political parties. And for example, we were able to get political parties to sign into a code of conduct leading to the election. And then we got civil society organizations to be advocates and to be naming and shaming breaches in the signing of this code of conduct. So I think that contributed civil society pressure and monitoring and naming and shaming, compelled a lot of our politicians to try do what is expected. Now, signing an agreement, it's a good publicity thing, but actually complying to it is another issue. And obviously, as I said, the mindset of Nigerian politicians is do or die. You must win by go. Many of them, I think the overwhelming majority of them have that mindset. But then obviously there are also good ones who want a good outcome and who work in that direction. And I think the role of some of those went a long way. But messaging from international organizations and through bilateral relations also went a long way. A lot of messaging was going on. You must get this thing right, and you must accept the result. And we don't care who wins, we are not supporting anybody, but we want a credible outcome. And we helped by passing information where we thought it was necessary for interventions and the correct messaging. And I think that worked. Because after the Abacha military rule, many bilateral partners of Nigeria introduced sanctions and measures targeting individuals, either blocking their accounts or refusing them visas and their families and so on. And since when they steal the money, they take it out. They also want to be able to access those resources. So any threat that they suspect can be executed in terms of preventing them. So they listen to some of these messages. And I think in the Nigerian context it has helped a lot. That's why I say for electoral commissions, for others that are driving reform processes, constructing an effective partnership and good relations really helps a lot in getting positive outcomes. I think, to my mind, these are important things. There may be other reasons.
I just had one footnote. The role of the African Union, the international players are use extreme pressure, no question. But the AU sent us observers, former presidents, elected presidents of African countries, including Ava Soya from Liberia, who got these guys in the back room and said, look, the future of democracy in Africa depends on how you handle this election. The stakes were that high, and so it was not just the big powers, but it was the African Union itself who said, this is too enough. Get it right.
Yeah, definitely. And there are also certain protocols and conventions, also of ECOWAS, the African Union, which were used to push Nigeria as a state, but also contestants towards compliance. That pressure and the way in which some of the civil society organizations took it advocated the also
Boko Haram had nothing to do with it. Boko Haram had nothing to do with any of this.
I don't think so.
You mean why the international people were so involved? I wish we had another hour to talk about how do you do an election in the Northeast zone when they're under state of emergency conditions, particularly in Yobe, Bornu, and Adamawa, and who else we know the details. How in the world do you do that?
Yeah, and we were able to do elections in IGPs.
That's the chapter I want to read.
So, yeah, but I personally, I don't think nationally the issue of the Boko Haram, well, I think we need an hour.
You still have some answers, right?
Yeah, but yes, I think there was a point made about credentials of the president. I don't want to go into that. I think a lot of it is political. It's not true. He had credentials. He's got his high school living certificate, but it was terribly politicized. And there's an electoral commission. Our conduct is guided by the existing electoral regulations. And with regards to nomination of candidates, parties nominate and they bring supporting documents. And once these documents are brought and we make them public, it is now left on the citizens or other stakeholders to pick holes, and to go to court to prove that somebody is qualified or not qualified. Also, we didn't consider it necessary for us to dabble into that controversy. Because as far as we're concerned, the documentation presented to us on its face value was correct. If anybody wanted to contest it, the courts are there to contest it. But there are challenges in the verification of candidates, which you mentioned, and it certainly contributes to violence in elections, whether during or after. Because this nomination process of candidates within political parties is terribly undemocratic. And unfortunately, there is a legal obstacle to an electoral commission in ensuring democratic nomination processes. And I'll give you a simple example. Something that we wanted a legal amendment to from 2011, and we didn't get it, and we had to do 2015 election without that amendment. In 2011, we were confronted with a situation in which political parties exploited a provision in the Electoral Act and nominated candidates that didn't even go through democratic nominations. And what happened is that there are two contradictory provisions in the Electoral Act. One says a candidate must emerge through democratic party primaries. But then another said, once a party nominates a candidate to stand for election, they cannot be removed for any reason whatsoever. So INEC, Electoral Commission, will monitor party primaries, will have a list of those who emerge through democratic means, but parties will send a list totally different. In fact, with people who did not even participate in primaries, and there was nothing we could do. We wanted to be proactive, but the lawyers advised us that that could compromise the impartiality of the commission, because they will start being accused of supporting one party or one candidate against the other. So, like we did with all the other nomination cases, let other people challenge it in court. And there were successful challenges. Some people will go to the court and say, look, I had the majority votes, but my party put me aside and sent somebody. And the court had passed judgments, that reversed that. But for us, if INEC now doubled into that, it would have been a serious challenge, even though we wanted to be proactive, but we didn't.
But just to add, which is the point I was trying to drive at, don't you think this present situation provides a unique challenge also on this issue? Since you know, and you and I know that, most of those in the government offices right now have issues with their qualifications, with their credentials. That if you can, like you said, you got the provision in 2011, and it was not passed until 2015, that you could do something within the commission using your office and influence you have to correct that empowers you, that once a candidate is submitted, contestant is submitted, you verify, you find out that this person is faulty. You can say, we have gone to do our investigation, just like you do as a university professor. When I come into school, you verify my credentials. After a while, we have found that this person has prevented what? Fraudulent activities. Okay, we'll give you a time frame to come and go defend yourself. If you cannot prove it otherwise, get out of the business.
No, but let me be very clear.
To save us time and the issue of fighting and violence, because that's been the major. We have motor touts who come here and get certificates and come here and want to run for elective offices. I've seen people die daily. I've been doing elections. I go there in the morning, I send my members there, they keep people, they do for nothing, and they don't even have no business. Some will come to election, voting for polling booths, don't even know who the candidate is.
That's true. But anyway, I think you are raising a lot of issues to address, but to be honest, frankly, sincerely, we had no issue as INEC with the qualifications of President Buhari. We had no doubt about that. So we couldn't have come out to, as far as we are concerned, the party submitted documents which we had no problems with. But when people said that he had no qualifications, then they had to go to court and they established he had no qualifications. And have those. Let me tell you another example. There was a senator who actually forged the documents for his nomination. And we were aware that the documents were forged. So what we did to be proactive, we called the candidate, his opponent, and gave him copies of that and said, go to court and prove that this were forged. And you know something, he went to court and it went to the appeal court and he lost because the senator was so powerful and he bought his way. So what do you do with that kind of situation as an electoral commissioner? You stick with the laws. And if there is a leeway, you try to explore it. But the bottom line of success is abide by the existing laws and regulations. Try to change them through legal revisions, if possible. You know, but again, you will be dealing with politicians who want to be elected, and you may not get those refuses.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Jenda, Professor Payden, and Professor Lines. And just before I stop, I just want to wish our Muslim brothers and sisters here happy Eid. I had expected a delegation from Nigerian embassy, but unfortunately today is a public holiday in Nigeria. That is why some of these chairs were empty. Yeah, but okay.
Some are in New York, isn't it?
In New York, commercial
Some of them are in New York for the
Okay. Yeah, but all this time we had a very good discussion, and let us put our hands together for them again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Professor Payden,